Hey everybody, this is Tyler from EQUES, and this is an extension of our EQUES channel podcasting. And today we are with Thom White, who is founder of White Law and also EQUES Law, and spent some time as a judge and an attorney. And I have been told since I started working here that he has the stories. All the stories. And so we thought it would be cool to start a podcast where we talk about that and let him share some stories. And today we're actually at the Cider Press in downtown Millersburg. They just opened up and were gracious enough to give us coffee, and because we're on the clock, so come by for some alcoholic beverages when you get off work. So Thom, I don't,
wait, just 1 second. We need a little something to add there. He's judge and attorney, but you were a judge for 20
Almost
years?
21 years, yeah.
Holy cow.
And a prosecutor for how many years before that?
Let's see, I was in the prosecutor's office 9 years before that.
Okay, so 30
yeah.
years
Wow.
right there. And that's not
Yep.
even the years of being an attorney in private practice, which is another 10 plus. So call it 40 plus years of legal experience here. So when we say that Thom will forget more than anyone else here at this table at least will ever know about law, that is an accurate statement.
Yeah.
Thank you,
That's true.
Jordan, although that does make me feel exceptionally old. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, so that actually works out great because that proves how much I don't know about you. So let's start there. Let's start with
Sure.
experience and how long you've been in it. And
My basic background is I grew up in a little town in northwestern Holmes County called Big Prairie. I'm a teacher's kid and a school secretary's kid, and graduated from West Holmes, went to Ohio State, and was actually wanted to be a teacher. Wanted to teach environmental education until through my sophomore year, I went in and saw my advisor, and he says, I hope by the time you graduate that there'll be jobs available in this field. And I go, you guys offer a degree program and there are no jobs? Well, we hope that there will be. I go, well, I'm not going to spend 4 years in college and, not have a job waiting for me. So I was bummed out. So I went over to the big library, which is a huge building on the Oval down in Columbus at Ohio State, and was going through, each college had course catalogs, and my eye was attracted to a purple one, which was the law school. And some folks that I went to school with had just been through a really bad experience. They live on the family dairy farm. They were being raised by their grandparents. Their parents had passed away in a car wreck, and all of a sudden the grandparents pass away, and there had been no planning. And in order to pay the estate taxes, which were very, very high at the time, they had to sell the farm. And I thought, maybe I could help people that way. So I decided to change my major to something that I just enjoyed, because you need basically a bachelor's degree to get into law school. So I changed my major to political science and studied European comparative politics, which was very interesting at the time because the Iron Curtain was still up, the wall was still up in Berlin, and
Wow.
we spent a lot of time hypothesizing about what the effect of communism would be upon the folks who grew up on it in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and those kinds of things, which it's been interesting to see how that actually has worked since that went down. So was fortunate enough to get into Ohio State's law school. I was a estate planning, which is the kind of thing that I was thinking about helping my friends, and federal taxation major, until I came back to Millersburg and was clerking for a lawyer here one summer. And there was a murder trial going on. And I found myself spending as much time as I could at that trial because it intrigued me. And the judge would, after work every day, would have me come into his office and say, okay, if you were the prosecutor, what would you have done different today? If you were the defense attorney, would you? And basically I got bit by the trial bug. So upon Upon graduation, joined the county prosecutor's office, served as an assistant prosecutor from 1981 to 86, was fortunate enough to be appointed and elected to prosecuting attorney, and then in 1989 was appointed and subsequently elected to the Common Pleas Court General and Domestic Relations Division, where I served until 2010, where a combination of factors. Number one, my wife said I was burned out about 5 years before I actually retired. And looking back, she was true. It takes something out of you to send young people to prison.
Yeah.
And after about 15 years or so of that, and it was just the beginning of the drug epidemic that has now infected every community around here. Number two, they've got the pictures of the judges up on the wall in the courtroom. It's the big courtroom on the third floor of the county courthouse here. And one day I looked up and I said, Thom, of all the pictures of the guys up there, you're the only one alive. And you kind of need to get out of here before this job kills you. And then my son, who is now the executive partner of EQUES, he had a real job. He was a teacher. And then he decides to go to law school. You have to figure that out. And he says, hey, why don't you retire and let's practice law together? So that's how White Law Office, which became EQUES Law Group, was formed. And that happened in 2010. And that kind of brings me up professionally up to speed.
Yeah.
It is not a traditional career path. I'll tell you this. Many of my colleagues as judges looked at me, and when you retire from being a judge, you become a retired judge, you accept assignment, because the practice of law is hard. It's much harder than being a judge. I'll be frank with you. But I always felt like Captain Kirk talking to Captain Picard in the movie Generations when he said, never let them kick you up to the Admiralty. If your first best destiny is commanding a starship, keep doing that. And really my first best destiny is telling stories to judges and juries, because in effect, a good trial lawyer is a good storyteller, because you're recreating in a courtroom something that happened out in the world. And most folks, be it a judge that you're talking to or a jury, they like to hear it chronologically, which is the way most stories are told. And generally the most effective storyteller is going to be the most effective advocate in a courtroom.
Yeah. Wow.
So your stress levels must have been like through the roof for a number of years. Would you have said before going through all that, did you think you were good at dealing with stress? Did you know that was kind of a skill set of yours? Because I imagine you have to develop it being a prosecutor and then especially a judge also. But
well, here's the thing. Stress comes at you from different aspects. And my main difficulty with dealing with stress was the age at which I took office. I was 30 when I became the county prosecutor. I was 33 when I became a judge. And other than having practice as a prosecutor in court, I know how to conduct court, etc. How do you deal with the tremendous responsibility of carrying very important decisions for people's lives? Who gets the kid in a divorce? Does a person go to prison? If so, how long? That does warp your mind. And I was too young to do that. So the best person to answer that is probably my family, because I would say, sure, I handled it just fine. But they were the beneficiaries, which is another thing. I can't understand why Chris went to law school when he saw the effect of a professional career like that upon the family. Yeah. The family always pays for it,
right?
Regardless of whether it's the stress that you bring home or it's how the community sees you. I remember one time Chris and his brother Dave were in elementary school, and I was prosecutor, and they came. They said, "Did you lock so and so's dad up?"
Oh my
This
God.
is one of their classmates. I said, "Yeah." They said, "What was he doing?" I said, "Well, he was dealing drugs." "Oh, okay." And then they turned and tried to walk away. I said, whoa, wait a minute, guys. What? Well, this guy said he's going to beat us up. Well, I knew this kid, and he was like, short, and my boys are pretty
Yeah, I
good
was about
size.
to say.
So I said, so what are you guys going to do? We'll handle it, Dad. I said, well, two things. Number one, we do not uphold the law by breaking the law. Okay. I said, number two, if you are caught or captured on your mission, your father will disavow any knowledge that we had this conversation. Oh, okay, Dad. Yeah, we understand. So I don't know how that came out. I'll have to ask him about that.
That might be have a story for the show sometime.
I like that.
You're going to have to ask Chris about
Yeah.
that.
Oh, man. So while other kids were arguing like, hey, my dad can beat up your dad,
Yep.
they didn't even have to have that argument. It was
Yeah.
just like, my dad will lock your dad up. Just relax.
Yeah.
It's hard on the families because my wife was refused service in certain stores because a family member of the store owner was involved in the criminal justice system.
Wow.
Yes, families are part of the professional journey and do suffer for the stands that you take, especially if you're in the legal profession and in public office. So, which is another nice thing about not having that anymore. Although, 2 weeks ago was the Loudonville Fair, and I had a guy. He's looking at me, and I had the grandkids, and I was trying to keep track of the grandkids. But all of a sudden, he walks up to me. He says, "Are you Judge White?"
Maybe.
I said, well, I used to be. I retired from that. And he got this kind of blank look on his face because, you become the job description.
Yeah.
And so I go, yeah, I'm Judge White. He goes, well, I thought you were, but you looked way too young to be Judge White. And I said, well, thank you. What's your name and where do I send the check? And he goes, well, I heard you had a son, but I understand he looks older than he is, so I thought maybe you might be your son. This is a story my son just loves. And I said, no, I'm Judge White. And I said, who are you? And he told me his name. And all of a sudden that clicked. I don't remember a lot, but every once in a while it'll click. And I said, how's life been after you got out of prison? I'd sent him to prison. And he said, first over there, I found a good woman. Wow. And that, if you're trying to rehabilitate yourself, having a strong, long-lasting relationship, especially somebody to hold you accountable, is absolutely essential. And he says, and I'd like to introduce you to my grandkids over here. So my grandkids got to meet his grandkids, and it turned out to be good.
Wow.
But that's, yeah.
That's a little nerve-wracking because you don't know how that conversation is going to go. Could go 50-50 maybe.
It could go very sideways. I remember I became, right after I became judge, there's an elevator in the courthouse, and I should have taken the steps. They're healthier, but I'd ride the elevator. And a lot of people in an elevator will just look at the numbers and hum a tune or something like that. I actually talk to people. So this guy gets on the elevator with me, this young man, and he looks familiar, but I can't place him. I said, "How you doing?" He says, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I go, "You look really familiar." And then he gave me his name, and I believe his name was Tommy Lee. All great criminals are known by their three names. Yeah. John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, Tommy Lee was a pretty big drug dealer, and when I was prosecutor, we spent a couple of years working up the case around him. And I said, okay. All of a sudden, I realized, gee, this elevator's awfully small and awfully slow. And he says, well, I just got out of prison. You're the first person I wanted to come see.
Wow.
Oh.
And I said, okay, well, how are things going? He says, well, I wanted to tell you that you wouldn't plea bargain my case. You made sure I was convicted of what I did, and I just finished my prison term. I just wanted to tell you that that's the best thing that ever happened in my life. I became a Christian in prison, and I wanted to come out and shake your hand and thank you, which he did as the door is opening on the floor I was going to get out on, and he left. And I don't know, I haven't seen him since. But, of course, some people get on the elevator. I said, I'll just ride down and back up with you because my knees weren't too strong after that particular encounter.
Wow. Yeah, that would be nerve-wracking.
Yep. So that's part of being a judge or a prosecutor in a small county. It's very personal.
Yeah.
You can sentence somebody in the morning and be in the grocery checkout line with their family in the afternoon. Yep. But here's the concept. If you treat everybody with respect, they understand you've got a job to do. They may not be happy with it, but you get by.
Yep. Yeah, and I'm 32, and I cannot imagine being a prosecutor by 33 and having to make those decisions now, you know? Cannot imagine.
I called them like I seen them.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
Some of them were popular, some of them weren't.
Yeah.
Decisions I made.
I've heard some things about maybe some mafia business or mob business at some point. Not that you were involved in, obviously, but
no, there was a time when we were prosecuting somebody who had ties to organized crime. And
In Holmes County, Ohio?
yeah,
well, haven't you ever seen the show?
it's
Amish
no,
Mafia?
it wasn't
Yeah.
the Amish Mafia. No, this was somebody who was from northeastern Ohio and had ties down here. And the sheriff's department said, "Listen, you need to just be careful for you and your family. We've received information. I can't remember if it was from the FBI or the state BCI, the Attorney General's office, that there could be some issues." So they actually gave me a police radio that was beside our bed, so we could call if our if our phone lines were cut or something, which was a real source of entertainment because we could also listen to the fire bands at night. And this is before the community had numbered houses, and to hear the fire department.
When was there not numbers on houses?
Well, this is back in the '80s, buddy. It's before.
I didn't realize that was a
before
new
number-
thing.
Yeah, either
Okay.
did I.
And so we're listening to the fire
Interesting.
trucks trying to find this place. And,
Yeah.
it's just past Cho Yoder's, and then you take a right, and it's like you go, which Cho Yoder, So it was good entertainment. Nothing came of it.
How did you get your mail?
How did we get our mail?
Yeah.
If they didn't have your house number, that's a good.
I'm really curious. I'm
Well, at the time I was living at Lake Buckhorn. They had units.
Yeah.
But that's why a lot of the Amish folks who have very similar names were assigned by the post office another middle initial. If there
way.
are several Marvin A. Hirschbergers, then there'd be Marvin A. Hirschberger, Marvin A. B. Hirschberger, and et cetera. And some folks still go by that. So,
wow.
yeah, that's how you differentiated it.
I had no idea.
Interesting.
Because everything was Rule Route 1 Millersburg
Yeah.
or whatever. So, yep.
Wow.
Didn't expect to learn that today.
Yeah, no kidding.
You also had to get to know, there was a nice lady who was a dispatcher at the Sheriff's Department as a young assistant prosecutor. Place names in Holmes County. You had to know where Mast Hill was, and I knew that because I went to West Holmes because it's the big hill between West Holmes but you also had to know Joe T. Miller Hill, which is the big hill going up into Berlin. You had to know whereabouts Calmouche is and Jimtown and all kinds of different little place names, because sometimes people would call in or you'd see a witness statement or something, and it wouldn't refer to, it referred to the common name, not, we were 3 miles north of Berlin, okay? So, and I still have that somewhere, that little hand-lettered map with all the local place names. So,
Wow.
Interesting.
That's awesome.
I kind of want to get into a story, and I'm going to try to tee something up here just because it kind of got cute in my head. The inspiration for this, I guess, I remember sitting here at the cider press, or back then it was, what did this used to be called before the cider press?
World Bakery, right?
Old World Bakery.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got hired at EQUES 5 years ago. And I remember
It's been
sitting.
that long?
It's been, I know, that's kind of wild too. But I remember sitting at a booth here, and it was one of my,
And Jordan has a really tough job. He has to make us look good. I got to tell you,
Yeah.
that's a
sometimes
tough
it's
job.
hard, sometimes it's easy. Who knows? It depends what case you're working on, I guess. But I remember sitting in a booth and hearing you tell some stories, and this is wild. And then after that, probably the best stories I heard, you and I got to take a trip down to Woodsfield we were doing some oil and gas educational seminars. So 2 hours in a car each direction.
Your Jeep was new,
It was new at that point.
and you'll notice I now have a Gladiator.
I don't have a Jeep anymore.
You're my inspiration, man, and you got rid of
I
it.
got rid of it. But I remember driving down that road, and I can't remember the exact details of the story, but it was something, you were a prosecutor, and there was some murder that happened in Marshallville. And I don't remember why I remember Marshallville, but I remember something about walking through a field, and I remember hearing this story and thinking, like, There could be a Netflix series about this. This is wild. I don't know if I'm queuing up, if you know what I'm talking about, but
that is the Krista Harrison murder. She's 12 years old, and it's the summer of 1982. And it is the first homicide that I was exposed to as a very young assistant prosecutor. And the first homicide that I was exposed to was the work of a serial murderer, a guy named Robert Buell from Barberton.
he only had 2 names, so he wasn't a good criminal.
He wasn't a good criminal.
Oh, Robert Lee.
Yeah. So, Krista Harrison's was abducted from a ball diamond that is within sight of her house by Robert Buell. She was taken to his house where she was tortured, eventually killed beyond resuscitation, because what a lot of serial murderers will do is they will attempt to, let's say, suffocate the victim and then bring them, resuscitate them back to life so they get to experience the thrill of killing the victim multiple times.
Jeez.
Not sure if that was his modus operandi. And then her body was kept in a fly-free environment at 120 degrees, which means probably the rafters of her garage. This is in the summer. And then he dumped her. And he initially dumped her up by a town in northwestern Wayne County called West Salem. But nobody found her. And so he moved the body to a road that, and this is going to take me back, I don't know the road number. It's a township road called Calico Road. It's near Lakeville in Washington Township down here in Holmes County. And of course, the body is discovered, and all of a sudden I'm exposed to the effect of a young woman's body being found in that neighborhood, which is, Lakeville's not too far from Big Prairie. I knew the people around there who grew up. And then also to see how, like, the FBI worked. That case involved one of John Douglas's early profiles when the FBI was just getting into profiling. And he told us, when you catch him, it was like spot on, okay?
So at this point, they knew who the killer was?
No.
They did not. Okay.
As a matter of fact, as it turns out, there was a previous abduction murder that Buell most probably did, for which 2 other guys were convicted. This is a young lady from Creston named Tina Harmon, and basically they got the wrong guy. And so what Buell was doing by abducting Krista Harrison was, and then displaying her up at West Salem and then dumping her down at Lakeville, was to say, because these guys have been convicted, they were in prison, and all of a sudden, same MO, very similar evidence. At the time, DNA wasn't as advanced as it is today. At the time, the CSI du jour was carpet fibers, and it was about the time of the Wayne Williams case down in Atlanta. And there were similarities forensically between the 2 cases. There was a task force that operated for, I'm thinking, about a year, maybe longer. And finally, one of his victims escapes. And he wasn't caught through any Sherlock Holmes or anything. One of his victims escaped, and all of a sudden, because he had been a suspect, they'd taken a look at him but couldn't develop a case against him. One of his victims escaped, and then he went on trial in Cleveland. Wayne County actually handled the prosecution, because either Wayne County, where the abduction occurred, or Holmes County, where the body was found, could have prosecuted it. And Wayne County prosecuted it up in Cleveland. He was convicted. I had to testify, actually, because in what's called a post-conviction hearing, as a young assistant prosecutor, I found out that our sheriff had actually hypnotized a witness who saw Buell dumping the body. It was a farmer up by Lakeville. And I was asked to do a memorandum on what's the legal and constitutional effects of hypnotizing a witness, which, by the way, we would not do now. And somehow the defense got that and had me testify. And I was sitting probably about 15 feet in Judge Mark Weist's courtroom from Buell, and got a chance to look at him. And his eyes were absolutely black and dead. I mean, you could just fall into them. And eventually he was executed. So, yeah. There are a couple things that stand out about that case, because I was only tangentially involved with it. One is we were in a spot that we could not get radio contact, and I thought I ought to report what was going on out there to my boss, the prosecuting attorney. And so I had to go find a landline, a phone, and walked up to a farm, was met at the door by a guy with a shotgun. I said, "Hey, I'm an assistant prosecutor, and I just need to use your phone if I can." And I went in, and this family had taken all the children, gotten them into the living room, and surrounded the kids with adults with shotguns and rifles because they didn't know, and the fear was just tangible. And what that kind of evil can do, not only to the families of the victims, but to a community, was something I'll never forget. The other thing I'll never forget is the defense thought the hypnosis thing was a bigger deal, but there was a local reporter who went down to cover his execution. His last words were, "The truth will eventually come out. The truth is known by," and he said Mark Weist, who was his judge, Martin France, who was the Wayne County prosecutor, prosecuted him, Roger Pennell, who was the Holmes County detective captain, who was part of the task force, and he said, and Thomas D. White. And so I was a judge by then. The reporter called me up after the execution and said, "How does it feel to have your name be the last word spoken by a guy who's being executed?" And I said, I don't think I have a comment on that, but that definitely stands out. Yeah, that was the Krista Harrison murder. And there are other stories that came out of that too, but that's the main thread.
I don't even know where to go from there.
How many victims does this guy have?
He had, I do not remember the number, but it was multiple.
Significant number.
Yeah, significant number. Young, young teenage girls, and some adults, if I remember. If I remember correctly, the person who actually escaped was an adult. But, yeah.
I feel like that's how it ends up ending a lot of times for serial killers, is someone is able to fight back enough to get away.
Right.
And then
right.
They just wait on them, basically.
Right. In the meantime, I've been exposed to others in other cases, but, yeah.
Wow.
And everybody, when they talk to me about my career, they want to know about the murder cases. Murder draws, evidently.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you have another murder case we were going to talk about. And I think we have time to do it on this episode, if you're okay with it.
Sure.
And it's fall. So you said it has to do with witches.
Yeah, it's a story called The Witch's Murder. And this is one that I prosecuted. And before we get into this, as a prosecutor and as a judge, you become privy to certain family secrets that you really need to guard. So whenever I tell a story, it's a story about things that don't have to do with the victim or the defendant in a way that tries to protect that. And also I try not to divulge things that weren't in open court. In this particular case was a 2-week trial, so there was lots of evidence about what happened. So with that said, this story starts not on Halloween, but on Easter Eve, 1986. And I get a phone call because I'm having dinner with my family. It's a Saturday evening. And one of the detectives from the sheriff's department is on the phone and says, "Thom, we've got an odd shooting. And it's either suicide or something else. Would you please come out and take a look at it?" Well, in a rural area, as a prosecutor, if you're going to be effective, you do need to go out into the field every once in a while for a couple things. Number one, to advise law enforcement on what they should do and shouldn't do, so nobody's constitutional rights are violated. As a matter of fact, the sheriff's department was once sued for violation of civil rights, and when the federal judge heard that the prosecutor was involved in the investigation, he says, well, that's good enough. They were relying upon legal counsel. The second thing is that you have to recreate what is going on out in the field, in the courtroom. And I always found it was better to be there so you can say, hey, can you take a picture of this from this angle? Mm-hmm. Because you're going to have to, recreate it. And the police officers are, number one, they're trying to secure the scene, make sure nobody else is hurt, and try to secure evidence, et cetera. And so I went over, and there was this lady who was sitting on the floor, slumped against her refrigerator, with a bullet hole in her forehead and a bit of blood that came out onto her forehead. And our county coroner at the time was a guy who he saw gunshot deaths, but he always operated kind of from the assumption that a gunshot death in Holmes County is a suicide until proven different. Okay. So as the officers processed the scene, eventually they moved the victim's body, and they found that she had a gunshot wound in her back and a gunshot wound in her forehead. And I remember conversing with the coroner and saying, do you still think this is a suicide? And he goes, worst suicide I ever saw. This woman really wanted to die. And I go, no, you shoot yourself twice.
Is there a reason that he would want it to process it as a suicide versus a murder? Is there from his perspective?
It's less paperwork, to be honest.
Okay.
It's less paperwork.
And it's probably not common here.
Homicide is not common.
Yeah,
right.
So you would assume it's a suicide or an accident.
It used to be we'd have a homicide about every 10 years or so.
Yeah.
Okay.
But just with that comment, it sounds like he was trying to push that through when logic says maybe something different happened.
He was, and as it was, in order to prove it was a suicide, he actually brought the guy who was the killer back into the scene.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. Because as I'll explain. So anyway, we find out it is obviously a homicide. And so immediately we go into, okay, this is a homicide. We need to identify who did it. And we always approached it through who is in the ballpark as a suspect and who is not in the ballpark. Mm-hmm. Where does the evidence lead us? Well, the guy who called the homicide in was an employee of the victim's husband. And he was there and he was acting awfully strange, but, being cooperative, et cetera. When the squad and the sheriff's initial deputy arrived, he was washing his face and his hands in the hose outside. And it was just, so we're sitting there, we're going, okay, number one, any homicide involving a spouse, you always check, where is the other spouse? Well, the other spouse, this was Easter vacation, had taken the kids to Disney World, and we were able to confirm. As a matter of fact, he called while we were there at the scene, and we were able to confirm that he was in southern Georgia on his way back. So pretty good alibi there. And so we go, are we ever going to find the firearm that did this? Because one of the reasons that the coroner was initially thinking it was suicide is that on the floor underneath the victim's legs was her handgun. And so they're thinking, boy, did she shoot herself? And it just fell down, et cetera, until one of the detectives, without moving anything, got down and looked in the barrel, and there was a dandelion seed in the barrel. So obviously that weapon had not been fired. So we were looking for some other weapon.
That's a wild little detail.
So in processing the scene, well, yeah, and the other thing that the detectives noticed was that blood does not run uphill, because the track of the blood, the little bit of blood that came out of the forehead wound, had gone down the forehead about an inch and then gone back up the forehead. And assuming she was not moving, somebody positioned her head In other words, it was initially slumped down probably and then moved back, which we thought was interesting. So as we started to process the scene, there was a bulletin board in the kitchen that had all kinds of information about fears. And as it turned out, the victim was writing a book about what people are afraid of. And so you come across this note that this person's great fear is driving down the road with the window down and a bumblebee hitting you in the eye. Okay. And so she was just kind of assembling, and we ran across this one statement that said, I hurt. I need to be hurt. There's something inside of me that has to be hurting people. My boss is so fortunate. His wife is so beautiful. And what do I have? I need to hurt. And that was an interesting, because it was, of course, in the victim's own handwriting, and she did not identify who she was talking about. We also started to come across certain beliefs that she had. She made a note once that she was able to summon an entity that she called a demon named Gabriel to keep the dust off of her clothes on the clothesline as they were drying, which is a kind of a useful entity, I guess. But her beliefs definitely weren't mainstream for this community. And when I say the witch's murder, this is what the defense brought out at trial. They were trying to make a big issue about her odd beliefs. One of her friends, who identified herself as a witch, did testify at trial. But as we're developing the case, we're going, man, we really need to find the firearm. And so law enforcement kept interviewing the guy who had called it in, developed as to whether he was a suspect or not. The crime lab came back and said, you're looking for such and such types of firearms. We found out he had bought one. And so he gave us permission to search his apartment up in Worcester. And we seized the firearm. That firearm came back with the test being positive that was the firearm. That was the barrel that actually fired the weapon, or the bullet that killed her. And so we developed that. He never confessed, charged him, and 2 years later, the case goes to trial. We put on the forensic evidence. We put on the fact that, we felt it was a fairly strong case, but it was a case that really divided the community, because the defendant was a guy who didn't even have a traffic ticket. He was from a good family. He was well respected. As a matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was at a seminar about about Murder Ridge, a guy who killed 3 people down by Nellie in Coshocton County. And somebody in front of me was talking, and I said, do I know you? And she goes, I went to school with your brother. I go, okay. And she says, you prosecuted, and she's talking about the case I'm talking to you guys about. And I said, yes. She goes, he didn't do it. And I said, well, it's been almost 40 years.
Wow.
And the thing that I'll remember from that trial is I couldn't figure out a way to get that. We identified the defendant, the accused, as the person about whom the victim was writing. And his explanation, he opened the door to me getting the friend of the victim, who was the practicing witch, to be able to read that to the jury. But then the defendant took the stand, and I said, okay, I showed him a picture of the victim. I said, you're understanding that the evidence shows, as a matter of fact, your expert and our expert both say a bullet from this weapon killed this woman. He says, yes. I said, and that weapon was in your possession on the day of the murder? Yes. And that's when you're, as a prosecutor, you're supposed to shut up and sit down. Okay? You're not supposed to ask the extra question, but I felt lucky. So I said, what's your explanation for that? And his answer was, the evidence speaks for itself. And I said, okay, now I'm done. Okay? The defense, the reason I say that the defense was that this woman somehow contributed to her own murder because she may have interviewed somebody who shared a secret with her that then got into all this occult stuff. And at one point, the defense attorney says, hey, we don't know, because this woman also believed in reincarnation. She believed she was Pocahontas. And so you never know. Maybe she was dissatisfied with her life and wanted to be reincarnated again, at which, the jury looks at me and I look at them and it's like, boy, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But the jury convicted him. And I remember running into the foreman of the jury at Walmart a couple weeks after the trial. And he said, Thom, you did a good job. I said, thank you, and thank you for the verdict. He said, but I want to know how much. I said, how much what? He goes, how much did you have to pay that defense attorney to make you look like F. Lee Bailey? I said, I didn't pay him anything. So, that's the witch's murder. There was all kinds of occult stuff. The fact that she was, the defense even put forward the fact that since she was murdered on the Easter Eve, that is evidently a high witch's holy day, etc., and maybe her coven put out a contract on her, or, etc. It was just an excessively weird case. But yeah, that's the story of the witch's murder.
I have a question. So it sounds like the guy didn't mind being convicted for this. I mean, he didn't seem to argue. And you said he let you guys come in and
I was gonna ask
look at
about
his
that
gun,
too.
because I don't know if I misheard that, or did he just open the door? Do you have to get a warrant? He didn't seem to resist throughout any of this story, and I'm confused by that.
Except for not confessing, he was very cooperative. But
Right.
here's the thing about one minor detail that I left out. He used a bullet that was coated with what was called Nyclad. Nyclad is a nylon kind of liquid that you can dip your bullets in, and it doesn't let up your barrel. And the nylon burns up as it goes through the barrel. And therefore, it's very difficult to get normal ballistics. As a matter of fact, the rumor was that you could not get ballistic matches off of Nyclad bullets because it was basically a greasy bullet, okay? However, both our expert and the defense expert, who was the head of the Kentucky State Police, were able, if you look at the base of the bullet, it will leave the striations that you need that the bullet is imprinted with as it travels through the barrel. And that's how they were able to
Got
make
it. So he thought he was okay. They're not going to be able to put this together.
When he was confronted by law enforcement and they said, listen, the crime lab says your weapon is the murder weapon, he said, no, it can't be. So
okay.
He thought he pulled one on you, huh?
he thought he was getting away with it. Yep.
I have another question. Is it common, you were talking about going out into the field and when murders would happen or when things would happen, is it common for prosecutors to do that?
No, as a matter of fact, I'd take a ribbing from the lawyers. The other lawyers, they would get me like sheriff badges and toy guns for Christmas, etc. But I don't think anybody can argue with our record of success. I lost my first trial as a prosecutor and just vowed I'd never lose another, and we never did. Of course, it was only, 8-9 years, and we didn't have the intense caseload that they have now in the courts due to the drug epidemic.
Yeah.
But we were fortunate not to. And really, in a criminal prosecution, a prosecutor does have quite a bit of advantages. He chooses the charges, chooses the evidence that he puts on. He wears the white hat, et cetera. People want to believe the prosecutor. They know prosecutors aren't going to get reelected if they start charging people who didn't do anything. Right. And so, best job I ever had.
That's awesome.
Being prosecuting attorney. Yeah, I loved it.
It's incredible. Well, what time do we have there, Thom, on your watch?
Well, I think we've been going for about 45 minutes or so.
Awesome. I think that's probably a good place to
good stopping point.
Wrap up. But real quick, do you want to tell us about this watch you got here? What your tactic you use in the courtroom?
I like pocket watches, and I just got one. This is actually an advanced Christmas gift because my wife said, when I got it, I said, hey, I'm getting a new pocket watch. She said, that was going to be your Christmas gift. You're so hard to get for. And I said, okay, so this is my advanced Christmas gift. But I like pocket watches to use in court because there are times that you'll run into an opponent who doesn't understand the value of quality storytelling. And if they're starting the board, the judge or jury, and you just take a pocket watch out of your pocket and you flip it open and you look at it and you flip it around a little bit, it tends to attract attention. And it's a lot more gentlemanly than maybe ripping paper while your opponent is talking. So, yeah, it's an effective. Now, having said this, if any judges that I practice in front of hear this, they'll make me keep my pocket watch in my pocket. Yeah.
That's
and
great.
That's just part of the art.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tom. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Anytime.
We'll see you next time, I guess.
See you next time.
Okay.